If every country on Earth owes money, who exactly are they paying? Because it's not another country, it's not a bank, it's not even a person. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. The entire planet owes $315 trillion, 3 times the size of the global economy. And when you trace every dollar of that debt, follow every creditor, track every bondholder, you arrive at something that should stop you cold. The world owes money to itself. The whole thing is circular. And that circularity isn't a flaw, it is the system. 4 men across 3 centuries each built a piece of this machine, and every piece made the trap harder to escape. They constructed a financial architecture where debt is never meant to be repaid, where governments borrow in perpetuity, where interest flows eternally upward, and where the architects collect rent on every transaction, every crisis, every bailout. This isn't conspiracy theory. The meetings are documented. The mechanisms are public record. And once you see how they assembled it century by century, you'll realize that $38 trillion isn't a failure. It's the machine running at full speed. Here are the 4 architects, 4 turning points, and the reason every government on this planet is locked inside a cage they helped build. The first one did something in 1694 that no ruler, no merchant, no empire had ever attempted before. Before 1694, sovereign borrowing was crude. Kings needed money, went to merchants, promised repayment. Sometimes they paid, sometimes they defaulted. But debt was always temporary. It got repaid or written off. The ledger cleared. William Patterson destroyed that model forever. A Scottish merchant with a history of failed ventures, Patterson had spent years chasing wealth. Then, in 1691, while England was bleeding money in its war against France, he saw the opening that would change civilization. King William III was desperate. The royal treasury had been emptied by military campaigns. Traditional moneylenders wouldn't touch English debt because the crown had a track record of default. No one would lend to England. That's when Patterson walked in with a proposition so radical that if the king had fully understood what he was agreeing to, he might have had Patterson arrested instead. He would gather a consortium of wealthy merchants willing to lend the government £1.2 million, roughly $300 million in today's currency. But the twist was in the terms. The government would never pay back the principal. Not in a year, not in a decade, not ever. Instead, it would pay 8% interest annually forever. And to administer this arrangement, Patterson proposed building a brand new institution, the Bank of England. Here's how the machinery worked. Merchants handed gold to the bank lent it to the crown. The crown paid interest each year from tax revenue, but the original sum stayed on the books permanently. The loan had no expiration date. Why would any lender agree to never getting their money back? Because Parliament guaranteed the interest. The full taxing authority of the state stood behind every penny, and the banknotes merchants received, those could be traded freely functioning as currency that generated yield, money that made money. Parliament signed off on the plan in 1694. The Bank of England opened its doors, and something unprecedented entered the world: permanent national debt. Not a crisis to resolve, but a structural feature of governance itself. And here's why this still controls your life today. The government was locked into paying £96,000 annually forever, on a loan it would never retire. But Patterson's deeper innovation was even more radical. The Bank of England received authority to issue paper currency backed by government debt. Debt became the raw material of money. A feedback loop: the more the government borrowed, the more money could be printed. Every dollar in your wallet right now, every digit in your bank account exists because a government somewhere borrowed it into existence. If you're a banker, it's the most elegant invention in financial history. If you're a taxpayer, it's a treadmill you're paying for something that's engineered to never go away. Within half a century, every major European power adopted the model. When America won independence, Alexander Hamilton replicated the Bank of England's design: perpetual bonds, interest from taxation, debt as the backbone of money. Patterson himself died in 1719 without much personal fortune, but the infrastructure he created is still standing 331 years later. Britain has never eliminated its national debt, not once. It's been rolled over, restructured, expanded, but the balance has never hit zero. The trap was laid in 1694. Every government that followed walked straight into it, but Patterson only built the cage. The next architect did something far more dangerous. He made sure no one could ever break out of it. And he did it using a weapon more powerful than any army in Europe. By the early 1800s, governments across Europe had accepted debt as permanent. They borrowed for wars, roads, daily operations. But sovereign lending was disorganized, each loan a separate negotiation. Interest rates swinging wildly, only the ultra-wealthy participating. Nathan Rothschild didn't just enter this market, he rebuilt it from the ground up. He turned sovereign debt from a cottage industry into a global machine. The Rothschilds began in Frankfurt's Jewish Quarter. Meyer Amschel Rothschild ran a coin-dealing business, but quickly realized trading currency was pocket change compared to managing credit for the powerful. He became personal financier to the Prince of Hesse, one of Europe's wealthiest aristocrats, and from that single relationship launched a dynasty. Meyer's masterstroke was geographic. He placed each of his 5 sons in a different capital: Nathan in London, James in Paris, Salomon in Vienna, Karl in Naples, Amschel in Frankfurt. No banking family had ever attempted this. In an era where information moved at the speed of a horse, the Rothschilds operated a private network that outpaced governments. One brother issued credit in London, while another collected repayment in Vienna. If revolution consumed Paris, Frankfurt stayed solvent. If war bankrupted Naples, London absorbed the shock. Nathan, based in London, was the family's sharpest strategist. During the Napoleonic Wars, he financed the British military effort. But his real innovation was structural. Rather than lending directly to the government, he purchased sovereign bonds at a discount, then resold them to a wide pool of investors at a higher price. He invented the secondary bond market. The government received instant capital. Rothschild pocketed the margin, and investors received a liquid, tradable asset guaranteed by the state. This changed everything. Before Rothschild, sovereign debt was illiquid, locked in vaults, held by a handful of lenders who couldn't exit. Nathan made it tradable. Suddenly, government debt behaved like a commodity. It could be bought, sold, speculated on, leveraged against. A market was born, and with it, a new kind of power. The family's intelligence network became legendary. Their couriers moved information faster than any government channel. The famous Waterloo story that Nathan learned of Napoleon's defeat a full day before London may be embellished, but the core truth is solid. Nathan reportedly sold British bonds right after the battle, creating panic that Britain had lost. Prices cratered. He bought at the bottom. When real news arrived and prices surged, his profit was staggering. Myth or fact, the principle stands. In the age of empires, information was now worth more than armies, and the man who controlled the flow of both money and intelligence controlled everything. By the 1820s, the Rothschilds didn't just finance governments, they decided which governments survived. A country that couldn't secure a Rothschild loan was a country the market abandoned. They became the credit rating agency of the 19th century, except there was no appeals process. Real power wasn't accumulating gold. Real power was deciding who could access capital, on what terms, at what cost. They didn't topple monarchs. They made monarchs dependent. The throne was no longer the most powerful seat in Europe. The bond market was. Here's where the debt trap fundamentally changed. Before the Rothschilds, a government could walk away from its obligations. Default was painful but survivable. Rothschild made it impossible by weaving sovereign debt into an international web. A British bond owned by a French insurer pledged to a German bank, securing a loan for an Austrian industrialist. Ownership so layered that a single default would cascade through the entire continental financial system. Governments weren't merely borrowing anymore, they were captive. A cycle with no exit. At their zenith in the mid-1800s, the Rothschilds commanded more wealth than most sovereign nations. Nearly all of it flowed from a single source: interest on government debt. They manufactured nothing. They built no products. They employed no factory workers. They lent to states and harvested the yield indefinitely. And that yield came from one place: the taxes ordinary people paid every year without knowing where the money actually went. A farmer in Yorkshire paying his annual levy had no idea that a fraction of every pound traveled through the treasury, across the bond market, and into a Rothschild account in Paris, a seamstress in Lyon, a dock worker in Hamburg. Every laboring person in Europe was feeding the machine without ever seeing it. Patterson invented the permanent loan. Rothschild scaled it across the planet and made it inescapable through interconnection. By 1815, every major European government was caught inside the machine. But even the Rothschilds had a limit. They could only lend money that existed. The third architect removed that limit entirely, and he did it by creating something that shouldn't be possible: a machine that prints money out of thin air. And he hid it inside a lie so convincing that Congress voted for it without understanding what they'd done. By 1900, the United States was emerging as an economic giant, but its financial plumbing was still primitive. Banks operated in isolation. The money supply was shackled to gold reserves. There was no central authority to manage credit or absorb shocks. J.P. Morgan changed that, not out of civic duty, but to fortify his own empire. In 1907, a brutal financial panic swept the country. Markets collapsed, banks folded, credit froze. Morgan personally summoned New York's most powerful bankers to his library, barred the doors, and pressured them to rescue failing institutions. It worked. The panic subsided. Morgan became America's unofficial central banker. But he was 70. The next crisis would need a permanent mechanism, not one man's willpower. The obstacle was political. Americans despised central banks. Both the first and second banks of the United States had been killed by populist revolt. Any new institution would need careful disguise. In November 1910, a small group Senator Nelson Aldrich, Morgan and Rockefeller representatives, and senior Wall Street financiers traveled secretly to Jekyll Island, Georgia. They used fake names at the station. They boarded a private rail car with the blinds drawn. For 9 days behind closed doors at a private hunting club, they drafted a new monetary system. If the public discovered private bankers were writing the rules of the nation's money supply, the political fallout would be devastating. The result was a masterpiece of political packaging. It wouldn't be called a central bank, the Federal Reserve System. Not centralized 12 regional banks. Not Wall Street. Controlled a presidentially appointed board of governors. On paper, democratic, decentralized, public serving. The real architecture told a different story. Each regional Fed was owned by private banks in its district. Those banks elected regional boards. And the true center of gravity, creating money and purchasing government debt, was concentrated in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, dominated by the same institutions that designed the system on Jekyll Island. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act on December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, while half of Washington was already gone for the holidays. Most congressmen who voted had never read the full bill. And with that single vote, the debt trap entered a dimension that Patterson and Rothschild could never have imagined. Because what the Federal Reserve could do next broke every rule of money that had existed for thousands of years. The critical shift. Before the Fed, the government's borrowing had a natural ceiling. It could only borrow what private banks had available. The Fed eliminated that ceiling. The process is deceptively simple. The government issues a bond, the Fed purchases it with dollars conjured into existence, and the government spends the new money. The debt sits on the Fed's balance sheet, backed by nothing except the assumption that taxpayers will keep servicing it forever. Right now, the Federal Reserve holds over $4 trillion in Treasury bonds purchased with money that didn't exist until the moment of sale. That's not theory. It's on their balance sheet. You can look it up. This is the engine of unlimited sovereign debt. The Fed guarantees a permanent buyer for Treasury bonds. The government never runs out of lenders. Debt rolls over endlessly, and interest flows from taxpayers into the institutions holding the bonds. Part of the taxes deducted from your paycheck this month went to service this debt, not to build a road, not to fund a school, but to pay interest on obligations that were designed to never be paid off. Morgan died in 1913, the same year his creation came to life. But the Federal Reserve is the mechanism behind every dollar of America's $38 trillion. Without it, borrowing at this scale would be physically impossible. The market would refuse. With the Fed as backstop, there is no ceiling. The debt trap became limitless. So by now, the system had 3 layers: permanent debt, global interconnection, infinite money creation. You'd think that's enough. But there was still one escape hatch. A country could technically refuse to pay, declare default, absorb the pain, and start over. The fourth architect closed that door forever. And the way he did it destroyed the economies of entire continents in the process. By the 1970s, the machine was humming across the developed world. Every industrialized nation borrowed perpetually, rolled over debt, serviced interest as routine. But developing nations had borrowed heavily for modernization, and many were falling behind. The system was approaching a breaking point. Then Paul Volcker sealed it shut. Volcker was a 6'7" chain-smoking economist who Wall Street nicknamed Tall Paul. He became Federal Reserve Chairman in 1979, inheriting an economy in crisis. Inflation exceeded 10%. The dollar's credibility was crumbling. Where others hesitated, Volcker was ice cold. His solution was blunt: raise interest rates until inflation broke, regardless of who got crushed in the process. He pushed the federal funds rate from 11% to 20%, the highest in American history. Unemployment surged. Factories closed. Farmers lost their land. Inflation collapsed, but the shockwave traveled far beyond U.S. borders. And what it did to the developing world was nothing short of economic warfare, even if that was never the stated intention. Throughout the 1970s, developing nations had borrowed billions at low rates. When Volcker tripled rates, those loans became impossible to service. Mexico owed $80 billion, Brazil $60 billion, Argentina $40 billion. For many, annual interest now exceeded total export earnings. August 1982. Mexico told its creditors it couldn't pay. Under normal rules, creditors absorb losses and the system resets. But American banks were exposed. Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan had lent the bulk of that money. Mexico walking away meant catastrophic losses across Wall Street. Volcker engineered a rescue through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF extended emergency loans just enough to keep interest flowing to American banks. But the conditions were savage: slash spending, sell state enterprises, open your economy to foreign capital, devalue your currency, surrender sovereignty for the right to remain indebted. The crucial detail: IMF loans didn't shrink the debt. They restructured it. Think of it like transferring your credit card balance to another card with a lower rate. You feel relief, but the debt never disappears. It just changes hands. That was Volcker's true contribution to the machine. When debt becomes unpayable, don't cancel it, refinance it, keep the interest flowing, and extract political control as the price of continued credit. Debt became a lever of geopolitical power. Nations that couldn't pay were forced to reshape their economies to creditor specifications, privatize industries, cut wages, open borders to foreign investment. The formula echoed for 4 decades. Greece, 2010, forced to sell islands and ports. Argentina, cyclically trapped in a default restructure loop spanning generations. Sri Lanka, 2022, surrendering a strategic port to Chinese creditors. The pattern never changes. IMF, intervention, austerity imposed, sovereignty eroded, debt rolling forward, permanent and inescapable. Volcker died in 2019, but his system ensures the global debt trap has no exit. Countries that can't pay aren't permitted to default. They're restructured into permanent dependency. And interest keeps traveling upward toward the same institutions that have been collecting since 1694. Now here's where everything connects. Because when you stack all 4 inventions on top of each other, you see something that none of them could have built alone. A machine so complete, so self-reinforcing, that dismantling any single piece would collapse the global economy. And you, whether you know it or not, are inside it right now. Patterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it infinite. Volcker made it inescapable. Stack those layers, and you get $315 trillion in worldwide debt, none of which will ever be retired. All generating interest. All threaded through a system where default anywhere triggers collapse everywhere. Let that sink in. The machine doesn't need a conspiracy to keep running. It doesn't need villains in a dark room. It sustains itself. Every government that borrows reinforces the system. Every taxpayer who pays interest feeds it. Every central bank that prints money expands it. The machine runs on momentum, and 3 centuries of momentum is almost impossible to stop. Take the American piece, $38 trillion in federal debt. Those bonds pay roughly $1 trillion per year in interest, funded by your taxes. Workers pay the government pays bondholders. The bondholders are institutions serving the wealthiest tier of society. It's a wealth transfer with no expiration date. And the government owes another $18 trillion to itself, Social Security, Medicare. When those programs need cash, the government borrows more. A loop feeding a loop. Every major economy runs the same cycle. Japan, Europe, China, all cross-linked. Japan holds American treasuries. America holds European debt. Europe holds developing world obligations. Everyone owes everyone. Interest always flows upward. Here's the part that should terrify you. If the U.S. actually repaid its $38 trillion tomorrow, the money supply would implode because dollars exist only because the government borrows them into existence. Eliminate the debt. Eliminate the currency. The system cannot be paid off. It was never designed to be. Who's collecting? BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity, asset managers controlling tens of trillions. They buy government bonds with other people's savings and harvest roughly $1 trillion per year from U.S. debt alone. These firms are the modern successors to the financial dynasties of the 19th century. They don't claim territory, they claim markets. They don't command armies, they command dependency. That annual trillion in interest is the largest silent wealth transfer in human history. It's not labeled a tax. It's called debt service. But the mechanics are identical. Labor pays, capital collects, and the principle never moves. History delivers one lesson louder than all others. Real power doesn't come from hoarding gold. It doesn't come from armies or territories or natural resources. It comes from controlling access to credit on what terms, at what price, and for whom. The Rothschilds proved it in Europe. Morgan proved it in America. Volcker proved it on every continent that ever took an IMF loan. The names on the doors change. The addresses change. The mechanism never does. The debt trap is complete. 4 architects, 3 centuries, 1 system. And every person alive is living inside it, paying rent on a structure they never agreed to, built by men they were never taught about, for the benefit of institutions they can't even name. You were born into it. You work inside it every day. And until this video, you probably thought national debt was just bad budgeting. Now you see the cage. You see the lock. You see who holds the key. And understanding the machine is the first step to not being crushed by it. If this changed how you see government debt, subscribe. Because every textbook, every news anchor, every politician will teach you that debt is a problem waiting for a solution, that someday we'll pay it off, that fiscal responsibility will save us. The architects knew better. They designed a system where the debt can never be repaid because the money itself is the debt. Debt isn't the problem. Debt is the foundation. And interest is the rent we all pay to exist inside their system.